Welcome back to the Horror Shack. Tonight, we'll explore true horror stories for sleep that will keep you on the edge of your seat. But first, we would love you to comment where you're listening from and what time is it currently for you. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more spine-tingling episodes. Now let's get comfy. Story 1. The Ritual at Crimson Pier by Jacob A. Have you ever met someone who seemed completely normal, even boring, but then you find out something about them that makes your stomach turn? That was Annalise Carter for me. She was my high school English teacher. Quiet, polite, always wore these floral patterned skirts and beige cardigans, like some throwback from the 90s. Nothing about her stood out, at least not until the summer of 2012. Looking back, I guess the signs were there. But who really pays attention to stuff like that when it's someone you trust? I mean, would you notice if your teacher suddenly started getting a little weird? I was 19 that summer, fresh out of high school, trying to figure out if I wanted to go to community college or take a gap year. It was a weird time in my life, and when I got that Facebook message from Annalise, I almost ignored it. "Hey Jacob," she wrote, "I've been thinking a lot about you and some of your classmates. Would you be interested in meeting up for something special?" At first, I thought it was some kind of reunion thing, like a nostalgia trip or maybe even a small tutoring group. She was always trying to help kids find their potential or whatever. But then I noticed something odd. She wasn't just messaging me. A few of my friends, Lauren, Ethan, Sarah, got similar messages, and none of them really knew what to make of it either. What kind of teacher invites their old students out of the blue like that? And why us? Her message didn't give a lot of details, just that it would be an experience that could help us let go of the past. That part stuck with me. Let go of the past. What was that supposed to mean? Lauren was the first to say yes. She always had a soft spot for Annalise and said we should give her the benefit of the doubt. "She's probably lonely," Lauren said, shrugging it off. "It's not like she's some kind of psycho." At the time, I agreed. Annalise wasn't a stranger. She was our teacher for years, someone we'd trusted to help us graduate and get on with our lives. What could go wrong? The meeting was set for a Friday evening, down by Crimson Pier. Now, if you're not from Bayside, you probably don't know the place. It's this old, crumbling dock at the edge of town that barely gets any use anymore. The wood is rotting, the metal railings are rusted, and every now and then, someone talks about tearing it down. But they never do. Locals avoid it, mostly because there's nothing out there except the sea and the occasional fisherman. When Friday rolled around, I almost backed out. Something about it fell off. I couldn't put my finger on it. But why would a teacher, a middle-aged woman, want to meet us there at night? But Lauren convinced me to go. "Don't be dramatic," she said. "It's just Annalise. She probably wants to say goodbye before she moves or something." So I went, and I'm telling you now, I wish I hadn't. When I pulled up to the pier that night, I remember thinking it was darker than usual. The kind of dark where even the headlights of my car barely seemed to cut through the gloom. The place was empty, except for a few cars I recognized. Lauren's beat-up sedan, Ethan's Jeep, and Sarah's compact. The pier stretched out like a shadow into the water, barely visible against the inky waves. Annalise was standing at the far end, her silhouette outlined by the faint flicker of a fire she'd built. I could see her pacing back and forth, like she was talking to herself. I almost turned around and left right there, but I didn't. I parked and walked over to where the others were gathered near the entrance. Lauren waved me over. "There you are. I thought you'd chickened out." Ethan was leaning against his Jeep, arms crossed, looking uneasy. "Anyone else think this is a little weird?" he muttered. "Weird doesn't even begin to cover it," Sarah whispered. She kept glancing over at Annalise, who still hadn't acknowledged us. There were 7 of us in total. Me, Lauren, Ethan, Sarah, this quiet kid named Marcus, a guy named Kyle who barely spoke in school, and Jenna, who was always the loudest in the room. We all stood there for a moment, just watching Annalise pacing at the end of the pier. Finally, she turned and motioned for us to come closer. "Come on," she called out, her voice carrying over the sound of the waves. "We're all here for a reason." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but none of us wanted to be the first to back out. So we followed her. The fire was small, just enough to cast flickering light on the wooden planks around it. Annalise had laid out a strange assortment of items: a knife, a small metal bowl, a bundle of herbs tied together with twine. There were also these old-looking books, their covers cracked and worn, with symbols I didn't recognize. "Thank you all for coming," Annalise began, her voice calm but intense. "This isn't something I take lightly. You've trusted me before, and I need you to trust me again tonight." Ethan cleared his throat. What exactly are we doing here?" Annalise smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We're gonna free ourselves. Each of you carries something you don't even realize. Negative energy, bad memories, things that weigh you down. Tonight, we're gonna let it go." I looked around, expecting someone to laugh or call her out, but no one did. Maybe it was the way she said it, like she genuinely believed what she was saying. Or maybe it was the firelight casting shadows on her face, making her seem different. She picked up the knife and held it out, the blade catching the firelight. "We'll start with a small cut, just enough to release what's inside. Then we'll seal it with the flame, so it can't return." "What?" Jenna blurted out. "You're joking, right?" Annalise's smile faded. "This is serious, Jenna. You came here because you knew you needed this. Don't be afraid. I'll guide you through it." Nobody moved. The tension was so thick, you could feel it pressing down on your chest. Then, to my surprise, Lauren stepped forward. "If this will help, I'll do it." "Lauren, don't," Ethan said quickly, but she ignored him. Annalise handed her the knife, guiding her hand to make a small cut on her forearm. Blood welled up immediately, and Lauren winced but didn't pull away. Annalise dipped the bundle of herbs into the fire and pressed it against the cut. There was a faint sizzle, and Lauren let out a sharp gasp. "That's it," Annalise said softly. "The first step is always the hardest." One by one, she coaxed the rest of us into doing it. Some of us resisted, but Annalise had this way of talking, calm, reassuring, like she was doing us a favor. When it was my turn, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the knife. Annalise steadied me, her grip surprisingly firm. "Don't be afraid, Jacob," she said. "This is for your own good." The cut stung, and the heat from the burning herbs made my skin crawl. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the way Annalise looked at me, like she was seeing something beneath the surface, something I didn't even know was there. By the time we were done, the fire had burned low, and the night felt colder somehow. Annalise sat back, looking at each of us with a strange, satisfied expression. "You've all done well," she said, "but there's one more step." That's when I noticed the metal bowl she'd been holding. It was filled with some kind of liquid, dark, almost black, and she was stirring it with a knife. "What is that?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. "Just something to finalize the process," Annalise replied. "Each of you needs to drink it." That was the moment the unease turned into full-blown panic. "Drink it?" Sarah repeated. "Are you insane?" "This is too far," Ethan said, backing away. "I'm done. I'm leaving." But as he turned to go, Annalise's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "If you leave now, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Ethan froze in his tracks. I could see his shoulders tense, but he didn't turn around. Annalise stepped closer to the group, the firelight casting strange shadows across her face. "You don't understand," she said, her voice eerily calm. "What we've done tonight isn't just about letting go. It's about protection. If you walk away now, you'll be leaving yourselves exposed." "Exposed to what?" Jenna demanded, her voice shaking. Annalise didn't answer immediately. Instead, she held up the bowl, her eyes fixed on its dark contents. "You may not believe me now, but there are forces in this world that thrive on your pain. They attach themselves to you, feeding on your doubts, your fears, your regrets. What we've done tonight has weakened their hold, but it's not enough. This, she said, lifting the bowl slightly, is the final step. It will bind them, keep them from ever coming back. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan was the first to speak. You're insane. He turned and started walking back toward the cars. Annalise didn't try to stop him this time. She just watched him go, her expression unreadable. I can't do this, Sarah said, stepping back. I'm sorry, but I can't. One by one, the others began to back away as well, their faces pale, their breaths quick. I wanted to leave too. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Jacob, Annalise said softly. I looked up and realized she was staring directly at me. You feel it, don't you? She asked, the weight lifting, the air changing. You know this is real. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Stay, she said. Trust me. You'll understand soon enough. The others were already gone, their footsteps fading into the distance. It was just me and Annalise now, standing by the dying fire. What happens if we don't finish the ritual? I asked finally. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You don't want to find out. That was all it took. Against my better judgment, I stayed. The first thing Annalise did was reignite the fire, feeding it with pieces of driftwood until it roared back to life. Then she handed me the bowl. Drink, she said simply. I stared at the liquid, my stomach churning. It had a strange, metallic smell that made my throat tighten. What's in this? I asked. Only what's necessary, she replied. Her non-answer didn't help, but I was too far in now. With a deep breath, I raised the bowl to my lips and took a small sip. The taste was worse than the smell, bitter and metallic, like rust. I gagged, but Annalise didn't let me stop. All of it, she insisted. Somehow, I managed to choke it down. The moment I finished, a wave of dizziness hit me. The world around me seemed to tilt, and I had to grab the edge of the fire pit to steady myself. Good, Annalise said, her voice distant, almost echoing. Now sit. I sank to the ground, my head spinning. The firelight seemed brighter now, the shadows around us darker and more defined. Annalise began to chant under her breath, the words strange and guttural, like they didn't belong in any language I knew. As she chanted, the dizziness gave way to something else, an overwhelming sense of unease. It was like the air itself had changed, growing heavier, thicker. I could feel it pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, whispering sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was voices. They were faint, barely more than murmurs, but they were there. Dozens of them, overlapping and weaving together, their tones filled with anger, sorrow, and something else I couldn't quite place. I looked at Annalise, panic rising in my chest. What's happening? She didn't answer. Her eyes were closed, her hands raised toward the fire as she continued to chant. The voices grew louder, more distinct. I could hear words now, though they didn't make sense. Release us. End it. You can't escape. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside my head, and I started to yell, but my voice was drowned out by a sudden, deafening roar. The fire flared up, its flames shooting high into the air. For a moment, it was so bright that I had to shield my eyes. When I looked back, Annalise was standing completely still, her face illuminated by the fire. Her expression was one of triumph. It's done, she said, her voice calm and steady. What's done? I demanded, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone by the fire. I sat there, trembling, staring at the fire as its flames settled into a more natural rhythm. My head was pounding, and the strange metallic taste from the drink still lingered on my tongue. The voices, if they had been real, were gone now, leaving behind an unsettling silence. I wanted to follow Annalise, to demand answers, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was like the weight of everything I just experienced had pinned me to the ground. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, watching the fire crackle and pop, my mind replaying the events of the night on an endless loop. What had I just done? What had she done? The longer I thought about it, the more questions piled up, each one more disturbing than the last. Eventually, the fire began to die down, and the chill of the night seeped into my bones. I forced myself to my feet, my legs shaky, and made my way back to the car. The walk felt endless, the shadows along the path seeming to stretch and move in ways that didn't feel natural. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me, but there was no one. When I reached the car, the others were gone. They'd left without me. I couldn't blame them, but the sight of the empty lot made my chest tighten. I climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and trying to steady my breathing. Then I started the engine and drove away, leaving the pier behind. The next morning, I woke up with a splitting headache. My dreams, or what I could remember of them, had been chaotic and terrifying, filled with flashes of fire and shadowy figures. I rolled out of bed and stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face in an attempt to shake the lingering unease. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a smudge on my skin, some leftover grime from the night before. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, the mark didn't fade. It was small and faint, just below my collarbone, a jagged, angular symbol that looked like it had been burned into my skin. Panic surged through me. I didn't remember getting hurt during the ritual, and yet here it was, a physical reminder of whatever had happened at the pier. I grabbed my phone and called Jenna. She didn't pick up. Neither did Ethan or Sarah. By the time I tried everyone else, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Something wasn't right. Over the next few days, the mark didn't fade. If anything, it seemed to grow darker, the edges becoming sharper and more defined. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the dreams. Every night, I found myself back at the pier, standing by the fire as Annalise chanted her strange, guttural words. The voices would start softly at first, just a faint whisper in the background, but they would grow louder and louder until they were deafening. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the metallic taste of that drink still lingering in my mouth. I wasn't the only one. I finally managed to get a hold of Jenna a week later. She sounded exhausted, her voice hoarse like she hadn't slept in days. "Do you have it too?" she asked as soon as I said hello. "The mark?" I replied. "Yeah, do you?" "Not just the mark," she said. "The dreams, the voices." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Have you talked to anyone else?" I asked. "Ethan," she said. "He won't talk about it, but I can tell it's happening to him too. He sounded scared." "What do you think it means?" Jenna hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she was going to hang up. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think she did something to us. The dreams and the mark weren't the only things that changed. Over time, other strange occurrences began to happen. It started small, lights flickering in my apartment, strange noises that couldn't be explained. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination, the product of too many sleepless nights. But then the occurrences became more frequent, more intense. Objects would move on their own. Shadows would shift in ways that didn't make sense. I wasn't the only one. Jenna called me one night, her voice shaking. "It's in my house," she said. "What's in your house?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "I don't know," she whispered. "But it's here." I can feel it. I didn't sleep that night. By the second week, I was desperate for answers. I tried researching the symbol on my chest, but I couldn't find anything that matched. I even tried going back to the pier, but the place felt different now, like the air itself was heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. Annalise was nowhere to be found. I wasn't the only one looking for her. Rumors started spreading around town about what had happened at the pier. People whispered about the ritual, about the students who had been involved, about Annalise's sudden disappearance. Some said she'd skipped town, while others claimed she'd been taken into custody. But no one seemed to know for sure. The days that followed felt like an endless blur, as if I were living in some kind of half-awake, half-dream state. The feeling of being watched never left me. I couldn't escape it, whether I was in my apartment, at work, or even in my car. The mark on my chest burned sometimes, its jagged edges glowing faintly in the dark, as though something inside me had awakened, something that shouldn't have been stirred. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that the ritual, the mark, the dreams, they were just the result of the trauma, the collective shock of what we'd done, the terror of being a part of something so far out of the realm of normalcy. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't just trauma. It wasn't just our minds playing tricks on us. Something had happened that night. Something real, something terrifying. And it was still happening. Jenna became increasingly distant. I tried calling her again and again, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I drove by her house a few times, but the blinds were always drawn, and there was no sign of movement inside. The last time I passed, I noticed a car in her driveway, a car I didn't recognize. I called Ethan next. His phone rang once, twice, then answered. His voice was low, almost inaudible, like he was standing too far from the receiver. "Ethan, what's going on?" I asked. "I haven't heard from you, or Jenna, in days." He sighed heavily, and I could hear something strange in his breath. It sounded like he was choking on his words, like there was something stuck in his throat. "Don't come over," he rasped. "Just don't." "Ethan, what's happening? What's going on with you?" I asked, my heart racing in my chest. "I don't know. I don't know anymore," he said. "There's something in here with me. Something watching me. I hear it when I sleep." His voice broke, a strained, breathless sound that I could barely understand. "Ethan, listen to me. This isn't you. You need to get help." He laughed bitterly. "Help? No one can help us now. Not anymore." The line went dead. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to find out what happened, had to confront whatever it was that had taken hold of us. I didn't care how crazy it sounded. I needed to see it through. So I went back to the pier. Crimson Pier was even worse than I remembered. The creaking wooden planks seemed to groan under my weight as I walked toward the end, the wind whipping at my face, pushing me back like a warning. The once familiar place now felt foreign, as though it had changed somehow in the days since the ritual. There was no comforting scent of the sea, no sound of seagulls overhead, only silence. I walked to the spot where we had gathered that night, the place where the fire had burned so brightly, where Annalise had chanted her strange incantations. But the spot was now a hollow memory. The ground was blackened in places, scorched as though it had been touched by fire, but there was no sign of the fire pit, no remnants of the ritual. I crouched down, scanning the area, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. My eyes landed on something near the water's edge, a small, faintly glowing object, half buried in the sand. I rushed over to it and dug it out, my hands trembling as I realized what it was. It was a book. The cover was old, frayed at the edges, the leather cracked and warped from exposure to the elements. The title was barely legible, the letters worn down, but I could make out the word Revelations. I opened it, but the pages were filled with strange symbols and scribbles in ink that looked almost alive. The moment I turned the first page, the temperature around me dropped, and the world seemed to shift. The pier itself seemed to groan, as if it were aware of my presence. I slammed the book shut, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just some forgotten journal. This was something real, something ancient, and it had been left here for a reason. I couldn't make sense of it, but deep down, I knew that whatever Annalise had been doing, whatever she had believed, it wasn't over. The feeling of being watched returned. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one. Just the empty pier and the lapping of the waves against the shore. But I could feel it. I could feel it in the air. Something was coming. That night, my dreams were worse than ever. I dreamed of the ritual again, but this time there were no voices, no chanting, just darkness. The air was thick, suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My body was frozen in place as shadowy figures encircled me, their faces indistinguishable, their movements like liquid shadows. Then, one by one, the faces became clear. First, it was Annalise, her eyes wide and wild, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then, Jenna's face appeared, her eyes sunken, her mouth open in a silent scream. Ethan's face followed, his expression one of sheer terror. And then the others, the students, they all stood around me, their eyes pleading, their bodies unmoving. "You have to stop it," Jenna's voice whispered in the dream, but the words were muffled, as though something was blocking her from speaking. "Stop what?" I managed to ask, but no one answered. And then, from the depths of the shadows, I saw it. A shape, so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, emerging from the darkness. It was tall, too tall to be human. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its breath sounded like the crackling of fire, as if it were a flame given form. The shape moved toward me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The world around me began to fade, and I was left standing alone, waiting for whatever it was to take me. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. My heart pounded in my chest, my head throbbing with the remnants of the dream. But it wasn't just the nightmare that scared me. It was what I saw in the corner of my room. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But no, there in the shadows, just beyond my vision, I saw a figure. A woman, standing perfectly still. Her face was obscured, hidden in the darkness. But I could feel her presence, her eyes on me, her gaze unblinking. I blinked, and she was gone. But I knew she hadn't been a figment of my imagination. I knew she was real, and she was coming for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman I'd seen in the corner of my room wasn't just some twisted remnant of my nightmares. My mind raced, spinning in a whirlwind of dread and confusion. How could I explain what I'd seen? Was I losing my grip on reality? Or had the forces we'd awakened that night somehow followed us, reaching out to claim us one by one? I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The next morning, I made my way to the local library, the one I used to frequent as a kid, hoping to find something that might give me some clue as to what was happening. The place was eerily quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound as I wandered through the aisles, searching for anything that might be helpful. But nothing seemed right. The bookshelves seemed to stretch on forever, the titles blurring together in a haze. Then I found it. In the farthest corner of the library, buried under layers of dust, was a shelf filled with old, weathered books. Their covers were frayed, their spines cracked, as though they hadn't been touched in decades. But something drew me to them, a feeling deep in my gut that I couldn't ignore. I pulled one of the books from the shelf, its pages yellowed and brittle. The title was written in faded gold lettering, "The Dark Beyond." I hesitated, then flipped it open. The book was filled with references to rituals, ancient texts, and accounts of things best left forgotten. It didn't take long for my fingers to land on something that made my blood run cold. The very same ritual we had attempted that night. I read through the pages in a daze, the words feeling both foreign and familiar. There were references to summoning, purging, and binding, each step more cryptic and terrifying than the last. As I read, I realized with a sinking heart that the ritual wasn't just some misguided act of belief. It was an ancient, dangerous act meant to open a doorway to something beyond. The rituals were designed to free souls from darkness, but the cost was far greater than anyone could have imagined. I rushed home, the book clenched tightly in my hands. I couldn't waste time. I needed to warn the others, if any of them were still alive. But when I arrived, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Ethan. "Meet me at the pier." I didn't question it. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door. The pier was even worse in the daylight. The air was thick with humidity, the sky overcast and heavy, as if the clouds themselves were hiding some terrible secret. The waves crashed against the rocks in the distance, their rhythm almost mechanical, as though they were setting the pace for something awful. I found Ethan standing near the end of the pier, his back to me. He was facing the water, his posture stiff and rigid, like he was waiting for something or someone. I approached slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. "Ethan," I called out, my voice shaky. "You okay?" He didn't respond. He didn't even move. I reached out to tap his shoulder, but as soon as my hand made contact, he jerked away, spinning around to face me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with terror. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "You don't understand. You have no idea what's been unleashed." I stepped back, suddenly afraid. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" "I thought it was just the ritual," he muttered, running a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. "But it's more. It's them." "Who?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "The ones we called," he whispered, as if the very mention of their name would bring them into existence. "I don't know how, but they're here. They're watching us." His eyes darted nervously around the pier, scanning the empty space as if expecting something to appear at any moment. I felt a chill sweep over me, a cold wind that didn't belong to the ocean. And then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like someone, something, was moving in the shadows at the edge of the pier. I whipped my head around, but the shadows remained still. Only the wind stirred the edges of my vision. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Ethan's face contorted in a mixture of terror and disbelief. "It's them," he whispered. "They're here." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the pier, coming from the far end. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun around, expecting to see something, anything, emerge from the shadows. But nothing came. "Ethan, we need to go," I said, grabbing his arm. "Now." But he pulled away, his eyes wild. "No, you don't understand. If we leave now, it'll follow us. It's already here." "What's here?" I asked, my voice nearly breaking. "What do you mean?" Ethan's lips parted, but before he could speak, a cold gust of wind slammed into me, knocking me back. I stumbled and caught myself on the railing, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The air seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if it were pressing in from all sides. The once empty pier was now alive with movement. I heard a sound, distant, almost like a whisper. But it wasn't just any whisper. It was familiar. It was the same chant Annalise had spoken the night of the ritual. I turned to Ethan, my eyes wide with panic. "What's happening?" "I told you," he said, his voice cracking. "It's starting." I didn't know what he meant, but at that moment I didn't need to. The feeling was undeniable. Something was here, something that had been awakened, something ancient and hungry, and we were about to feel its wrath. The ground beneath us trembled. The wooden planks of the pier creaked and groaned, as if the very structure was fighting to stay intact. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sickening feeling that they weren't just whispers. They were voices, hundreds of voices, calling out from the dark. I turned around to face the source of the sound, but before I could even take a step, someone stepped out from the shadows. It was Annalise, but it wasn't Annalise. Not anymore. Her skin was pale and stretched tight over her bones, her eyes black as coal, devoid of any humanity. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold, empty smile of something that had long ago lost its soul. "Welcome," she said, her voice hollow, like the wind itself was speaking through her. "You've come to join us, haven't you?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "Join you?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. Annalise's smile widened, and she tilted her head as if studying me. "We've been waiting for you," she said softly. "The ritual is almost complete. Just one more step, and we'll be whole again." And then I saw it. Behind Annalise, something stirred, something massive. The air seemed to shimmer, like heat rising off asphalt, but it wasn't heat. It was something else, something far worse. A shape began to materialize in the fog. Something tall, distorted, its limbs long and gnarled. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. And it was coming toward us. Annalise's laugh echoed through the pier. "Don't worry," she whispered. "It won't hurt. Not much." And that's when I realized the ritual wasn't just about summoning something. It was about becoming it. Annalise had crossed over to the other side, and now, so had we. The words echoed in my mind as the creature loomed closer. "Your soul belongs to me." I could feel the weight of the words as if they were physically pressing down on me, sinking into my skin, my bones. My entire existence seemed to shudder in response, as if the very essence of my being was being pulled from me, slowly but relentlessly. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but no sound came. It was as if my voice had been stolen, erased from the world entirely. All that remained was the presence of the creature, filling every inch of the void with its suffocating power. My mother, her twisted, hollow expression still burned into my mind, was gone. And with her, every fragment of hope I'd held on is shattered. She had been a part of it, a part of this nightmare, luring me into this world where the rules of reality had no meaning. She had been nothing but a pawn in whatever ancient game had been set in motion long before I was even born. I tried to move, to flee, but my legs were like stone. I was trapped in this void of nothingness, in the creature's grasp, unable to escape, unable to fight back. Then, just as the creature reached out toward me, something happened. The fog shifted. A strange pressure in the air suddenly broke, and for the briefest moment, the creature paused. Its eyes flickered, its form wavering like a heat mirage. There was a crack, a tiny, imperceptible shift in the fabric of reality, like a fraying thread on the edge of an old, tattered tapestry. And then I heard it, a sound, faint at first, but growing louder, a voice I knew, a voice I'd thought I would never hear again. Ethan. My heart leapt in my chest. Ethan, the only person who could pull me back from the edge of this nightmare. But where was he? I looked around, searching the void, but there was nothing, just that endless, suffocating blackness. Then, out of the shadows, his face appeared, pale, disoriented, but alive. He was standing behind the creature, his body stiff with terror, but his eyes locked on mine with an unspoken determination. "Ethan," I whispered, or at least I tried to. The creature's attention shifted. It turned toward him, and I could see its lips curl back, revealing its jagged teeth in a grin that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. For a moment, I thought I saw something in its eyes, something close to recognition. Fear? But there was no time to dwell on it. Ethan moved, stumbling toward me, his hand outstretched. I reached for him, heart pounding. The creature roared, a deafening, guttural sound that rattled the very air around us. But Ethan's voice cut through the noise, steady and strong. "We can stop this," he said, his words laced with both fear and defiance. "I know how. We can stop it." The creature's eyes narrowed, its body contorting in a way that should not have been possible, twisting and bending at unnatural angles. It let out a low, menacing growl, its gaze flickering back to me. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice like the scrape of iron on stone. "There is no escape." I closed my eyes, focusing on the voice, on Ethan's voice. There had to be a way out. There had to be. He was here for a reason. He had to know something I didn't. Ethan took another step forward, and with it, the fog began to retreat slowly, as if the very air itself was unwilling to breathe in the creature's presence. It was weakening. I could feel it, like a leash being slowly pulled taut. "Listen to me," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "The ritual, it's not complete. We didn't finish it. There's a way to stop it, to reverse everything we've done." The creature screeched, its roar like 1,000 souls wailing in agony. It lunged toward Ethan, but something stopped it. An invisible barrier, a force field of sorts that shimmered in the air. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel it. The very fabric of the world around us was beginning to tear. The creature's power was waning, but in its place, something darker, something even more terrifying, was beginning to rise. Ethan's eyes locked onto mine again, his voice firm. "We need to finish what we started, together." I didn't understand. Finish it? What had we started? What was left to do? Then it hit me. The ritual. The ritual was never meant to open the door. It was meant to close it, to seal the creature away. But it hadn't been finished. And now, the very thing we had summoned, the very thing we had touched, was fighting back with everything it had. It was too late to undo the damage. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to stop it from taking us completely. Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The connection between us, pure and raw, sent a surge of energy through me, an electric shock that surged through my veins. A jolt of life. "Focus," he urged. "Think of the ritual. Think of how it was meant to seal the door, to close the way between worlds." The creature screeched again, this time so loud it felt like the very ground beneath us was shaking. It was stronger now, desperate, pulling at the very fibers of reality as it tried to break free. I closed my eyes, pushing away the fear, pushing away the whispers, and focused on Ethan, on the ritual, on the knowledge we had gathered. We had to reverse it. We had to finish it. And then, the key was clear. The final words of the ritual. The part we had left out. The part we hadn't understood. The darkness must be returned to the abyss. Ethan's hand tightened around mine as I spoke the words aloud. The air crackled with energy, a sudden explosion of power that reverberated through the void. The creature roared, its form twisting and snapping as if it were being pulled in every direction at once. For a moment, everything went silent, and then, with a sudden, violent snap, the creature was gone. The fog lifted, the oppressive air dissipating into nothingness. I felt the weight of the void lift from my chest, like a heavy burden being lifted off me. The pier reappeared, the familiar sights and sounds returning, as though nothing had ever happened. But the silence that followed was deafening. The air was still, too still, as if the world itself was waiting for something. I turned to Ethan, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw the exhaustion on his face. The terror, the weight of what we had just done, and nearly undone. "We did it," he whispered, but it didn't sound like a victory. It sounded like a warning. The creature was gone, but we both knew that this was far from over. The door had been closed, but it hadn't been destroyed. It was still there, waiting, and we both knew deep down, that whatever we had unleashed was not going to stay locked away forever. Story 2. The Keeper's Warning by David Jones. I'll never forget the day we first set eyes on the house. My wife, Sarah, and I had been searching for a home for months. Something quiet, peaceful, away from the city. We'd almost given up when we came across the ad. A grand Victorian mansion, built over a century ago, sitting on the edge of a remote coastal town. A perfect price, way below market value. And according to the listing, it was in great condition. Too great almost, but we didn't care. It was our dream house, or so we thought. The day we moved and felt like the beginning of something wonderful. The house had that charm. Beautiful old windows, a giant staircase, a massive living room with a fireplace. Sarah and I spent the first night taking it all in, unpacking our boxes and getting our kids settled. Our 3 children, all under 10, were just as excited as we were. But something didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way the house seemed to creak and groan at night, even when there was no wind, or the odd draft I kept feeling near the back of the house, despite all the windows being closed. I told myself it was nothing. It was just an old house. Things creak and settle. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it, a soft shuffling sound. At first, I thought it was one of the kids sneaking out of their room, but when I checked, all of them were sound asleep. I told myself I was imagining things, but the unease lingered. It was the next day that we found the first note. I was cleaning out the old cupboard in the kitchen when I found it, folded neatly inside a corner of the wooden shelf. At first, I thought it was just some old piece of junk, maybe a forgotten letter from the previous owners. But when I opened it, my blood ran cold. The handwriting was sharp, almost deliberate, like it had been written with a sense of urgency. You are not welcome here. The house has been waiting. Be careful what you disturb. There was no name, no return address. Just that chilling warning. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe it was the fact that I didn't want to believe it. I showed it to Sarah, but she shrugged it off, thinking it was just a prank from the previous owner or something left behind by some eccentric family member. I didn't share her calmness. There was something about that message that didn't sit right. Over the next few days, we found more notes, each one hidden in different parts of the house, inside a drawer, behind a picture frame, under the floorboards of the basement. Some were vague, others were unnervingly specific. Have you noticed the smell in the walls? I know you've seen it. The red door in the basement. Never open it. The keeper watches over the house. You will never leave until you respect the boundaries. It felt like I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up every time I walked through the house. Sarah said it was just the newness of the place, but the kids were starting to act strangely too. At night, they would come to us with stories about whispers coming from the walls. They'd swear they heard someone call their names, even though we were all together. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But what was it? What had we disturbed? And who was the keeper? As we continued to explore the house, strange things started to happen. Things went missing, important items, like my keys, Sarah's jewelry, even the kids' favorite toys. I'd find them in odd places, under the floorboards, inside the walls, hidden behind furniture. It wasn't just the objects, though. It was the way the house itself seemed to change. The rooms felt different. The temperature fluctuated wildly. 1 minute, the living room would be warm and cozy. The next, it would be freezing cold. The air was heavy, like it was pressing down on us. The strange notes kept coming. And every time I thought about the red door, the one in the basement, the more it haunted me. I could never bring myself to go down there. Sarah kept telling me I was overreacting, but I knew she was scared too. She would often go to bed early, avoiding the house as much as I was. It wasn't until we decided to dig deeper that we learned the truth. The townspeople were wary. They would cross the street when they saw us coming. They'd whisper to each other, avoid eye contact, and hurry along as if they knew something we didn't. One evening, I asked one of the locals about the house. He didn't respond right away. Then he said it. The keeper doesn't like strangers. I didn't know what he meant at first, but then he told me about the history of the house. Decades ago, there had been a family who lived there. Family members who were said to have vanished without a trace. Rumor had it that they were taken. No one knew by what or who. But there were whispers that a man named the Keeper had been looking after the house for generations. I don't know if I believed him at first, but after hearing it from multiple people, I started to get the sense that something was very wrong. The house had a history, one that it clearly didn't want us to uncover. One night, Sarah was upstairs while I was in the kitchen when I heard her scream. I rushed up to find her standing at the bottom of the stairs, frozen in place, her eyes wide in terror. "I saw him," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I saw the Keeper." I asked her what she meant, but she couldn't explain it. She said she'd seen a shadow moving in the hallway, a figure standing near the red door at the bottom of the stairs. She said it was watching her, waiting. That was it. I knew then that the house wasn't just old. It wasn't just haunted. Someone had been waiting for us. And we had no idea what we had just walked into. I tried to keep my composure, but everything started to make sense. The notes, the strange occurrences, the way the house felt so alive. We had disturbed something that had been locked away for far too long. The door. I had to open it, and when I did, we saw it. The air in the house felt thick, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sarah's scream still echoed in my ears as I stood frozen at the top of the stairs. The red door at the end of the hallway loomed like a silent witness to something ancient and terrifying. I didn't want to look at it, but my eyes betrayed me. They were drawn to it like a moth to a flame, like I was meant to open it. I turned to Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I can't go down there," she whispered, her voice trembling. I just saw him. I don't know how to explain it, but he's real. He's been watching us this whole time." I wanted to comfort her, but the words didn't come. I felt the pull too. Whatever this Keeper was, he had been waiting. I could feel it, in the way the house seemed to exhale, in the way the floorboards creaked as though something was stirring beneath them. I knew I had to face it. I had to open that door. With trembling hands, I reached for the old brass handle of the red door. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. As my fingers made contact with the cold metal, I hesitated. The last of my rational mind screamed at me to stop. But before I could pull away, the door creaked open, as if it had been waiting for me. The room beyond the door was pitch black, deeper than the darkness I had ever seen. I fumbled for the light switch, but there was none. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat as the floor beneath me groaned. Sarah stood behind me, her hand on my shoulder, her body rigid with fear. Then it happened. The darkness seemed to swallow the light, and I felt a pressure on my chest as if something was pushing against me. My heart raced as I stepped further inside. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, like something unseen was pressing in from all sides. I tried to breathe, but it felt like the air had turned to lead. I turned around to ask Sarah if she could feel it too, but when I looked, she was gone. "Sarah," I called, my voice hoarse. There was no answer. A strange feeling of dread crept up my spine. I turned to look again at the empty hallway, but it wasn't empty anymore. At the far end of the hall, standing in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, thin, with a hooded cloak that seemed to absorb the very light around it. It stood perfectly still, watching. "You've opened it," the voice came, hollow and distant, like it was coming from the walls themselves. "You've disturbed the boundaries." My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My legs were frozen in place. The figure didn't move, but the temperature in the hallway dropped, causing my breath to fog in the air. Every inch of me screamed to run, but my feet refused to obey. The voice, colder now, continued. "You can never leave. Not now. Not after what you've unleashed. I wanted to ask what it meant, but the question stuck in my throat. My mind raced. What had we done? What had we disturbed? The red door. The room. What was in there? As if answering my thoughts, the shadows around the figure seemed to shift. The air in the house became unbearable, suffocating. The house was alive, I realized. Alive and feeding off the terror we had brought into it. And now, the thing that had been hidden away for so long was awake. I turned back to the red door, desperate to leave, but the door slammed shut. The keeper has kept it locked for decades. The figure spoke again, and its voice grew louder, more commanding. But now that you've opened the door, the house will demand a price. I tried to move, but I was paralyzed. My breath was shallow, and I felt like I was suffocating. The pressure in the room was overwhelming, and the walls seemed to be closing in. In the corner of the room, something shifted, dragging itself across the floor. I turned, my heart thundering in my chest. A shape was emerging from the darkness, something twisted and unnatural. Its body was long, its skin stretched tight over bone, and its eyes, two empty, hollow pits, stared directly at me. It moved slowly, dragging its limbs across the floor. I couldn't look away, even though every fiber of my being screamed to flee. "You have let it out," the voice of the figure said again, and this time, I understood. This wasn't just a house. It was a prison that held something ancient, something that had been waiting for decades to be freed. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it all. Who was the keeper? Why had this thing been locked away? And why had I known we'd been the ones to unleash it? Suddenly, the air around me seemed to tremble, and a low growl filled the room. The creature that had emerged from the shadows moved toward me, its limbs jerking in unnatural angles, as if it had forgotten how to move in this world. Its eyes were voids, nothing but darkness. And in that darkness, I saw something else. A reflection of me. I froze. In the creature's hollow eyes, I saw myself staring back at me, but not just me. There was something else there. Something terrible. A part of me had been absorbed into that thing, trapped in the darkness. The fear inside me, everything I had ever feared, was feeding it. That's when I understood. The house wasn't just alive. It fed. It fed on fear. It had been waiting for someone to open that door, for someone to bring that fear into it. And now that we had, it would never let us leave. The house would keep feeding, growing stronger, until we were nothing more than a part of it. I spun around, looking for an escape, but the room had changed. It was no longer the familiar basement. It was a twisted maze, a labyrinth of walls that seemed to stretch on forever. My heart was racing as I searched desperately for the way out. "It will never let you go," the voice echoed. "The keeper has seen to that." And that's when I realized the keeper wasn't just a man. The keeper was the house. The walls shifted again, and the air grew even thicker, suffocating. I felt something pulling at me, tugging me toward the creature in the corner. My feet moved on their own, unwillingly, as though the house was claiming me. I screamed, called for Sarah, for the kids, but there was no answer. The air grew heavier, more oppressive, as the walls of the house seemed to close in. The floor beneath my feet groaned, as if it too was aware of what had just been released. I tried to breathe, but each inhale was like swallowing sharp shards of glass. My chest tightened, my pulse quickening as I backed away from the grotesque creature in the corner. But the room, no, the house, seemed to be reshaping itself, folding in on me. The walls distorted, and what had been a simple basement now felt like an endless, twisting labyrinth. I tried to scream again, but nothing came out. The creature's hollow eyes followed me as I stumbled backward, the fear choking me, holding me in place. It seemed to growing taller and wider, its limbs jerking in odd, erratic movements. It was the embodiment of pure dread, a physical manifestation of the terror that had been building since the moment we stepped foot into this house. "You can't escape," the voice came again. This time, it wasn't from the figure in the shadows, but from everywhere. The walls, the floor, even the air around me seemed to pulse with that same dark presence. "You opened the door. You let it out. Now it will take you." I tried to move, tried to run, but I was paralyzed. My feet wouldn't obey. It was like the house itself was holding me captive. I could feel its cold fingers wrapping around my heart, squeezing tighter with every passing second. I wanted to wake up. I wanted to believe this was just a nightmare, but it wasn't. I could see it. I could feel it. Then, from behind me, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, like a whisper in the wind, but it grew louder, clearer. The floorboards creaked, the doorframe groaned, and slowly, I turned, my body betraying my fear as I looked toward the source of the noise. It was Sarah. She was standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "David, we have to leave now," she screamed, her voice raw, filled with panic. She reached out for me, but the distance between us seemed to stretch, the hallway becoming longer and longer with each passing second. Her voice echoed in the halls, but the sound grew muffled, drowned out by the deafening growl that rumbled through the house. I didn't even hesitate. I sprinted toward her, my legs moving on their own, powered by the primal need to escape. But as I reached the stairs, the air seemed to thicken, turning cold. The house was fighting us. The moment my foot landed on the first step, I felt a sharp, icy grip on my ankle, pulling me back. "You can't leave," the voice whispered, right into my ear, as if the house was speaking directly to me. "You opened the door. Now you belong to it." With every ounce of strength, I yanked my leg free, but the pull was relentless. I could feel it, an invisible force dragging me into the depths of the house. Behind me, the creature, the twisted figure, was moving, its grotesque body jerking forward, its mouth opening wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I was going to be consumed. I could feel it in the marrow of my bones. "Sarah, go, run, I'll hold it back," I shouted, but she didn't move. She was frozen at the top of the stairs, staring down at me with wide, terrified eyes. I knew what I had to do. It was the only choice left. The keeper had said it. The house needed a price. The door had been opened, and someone had to stay behind. Someone had to keep the entity trapped inside. Tears blurred my vision as I turned back to face the red door, still ajar, now pulsing with an unnatural glow. The thing was already slipping closer, its dark limbs twisting as it dragged itself toward me. I could feel the evil rolling off it, feel its hatred for everything human. My mind raced. I was too far gone. I wasn't going to make it out. I looked back at Sarah. "Go, now," I screamed, but she couldn't. She wasn't leaving. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to sacrifice myself. But there was no other way. I had to contain the thing. I had to lock it away again. In a final, desperate act, I sprinted toward the red door, ignoring the dark force that tried to pull me back. I slammed it shut with every ounce of strength left in me, but as soon as I did, the house shook violently. A terrifying, bone-rattling roar echoed through every inch of the mansion. "No, you can't." The voice of the keeper sounded angry, frustrated, and powerful, as though it was coming from the house itself. The walls pulsed, shifting in rhythm with the growl of the creature trying to break free. But it was too late. I could feel the door locking, the walls of the house pushing against the malevolent presence. The room around me went still, and a deep silence took over. The creature's growl faded, and I finally collapsed to my knees, my hands pressing against the cold floor, exhausted, shaking. The house grew quiet. too quiet. When I opened my eyes, I was in the hallway again, no longer in the red room. The house had returned to its previous eerie stillness, but something was different. It felt empty. I wasn't sure how long I had been unconscious, or if I had even truly been awake, but everything around me seemed eerily calm. Too calm. I stood, my legs weak beneath me, and stumbled to the front door. There was no sign of Sarah, or the children, or anyone else. I rushed outside, the salty wind from the cliffs hitting my face. The coastal fog was thick, but the house, our house, stood as it always had, looming over the cliffs, watching. I looked behind me one last time. The red door remained locked, its dark secret hidden within. But I knew better now. It would never be truly gone. It would never truly leave. The house had a hunger that would never be satisfied. And no matter how far I ran, it would always call me back. And that's when I saw it. There, in the distance at the window, was Sarah's face. She was looking at me, her expression blank, her eyes empty. No, it wasn't her. It couldn't be. As I turned to run, the house seemed to pulse, as though alive, watching, waiting. And as I ran into the thick fog, I heard it one last time, echoing from the mansion, the voice of the keeper. It's not over. It never will be. And with that, I left the town, left everything behind, but I can never escape it. Not really, because somewhere deep inside, I know the house is still there, still watching, waiting for its next victim. And as I move from place to place, always looking over my shoulder, I wonder if I'll ever truly escape, or if one day, the house will call me back. If you actually enjoyed these stories, please subscribe and leave us a comment to the next horror story you'll want us to tell. Till then, see you in the next one.